He was 23 years old, unknown, and invisible in a city that devoured invisible people for breakfast. He walked into that casting room with nothing but a name nobody recognized and a hunger that nobody could yet see. And on the other side of that door sat a young man who would one day become one of the most enduring icons in the history of American cinema. A man who had spent months preparing, drilling, perfecting himself for exactly this kind of moment. Two young men, one room, one role, and a single sentence spoken afterward that neither of them would ever forget for the rest of their lives. But that is not where the story begins. To understand what happened in that casting room in 1954, you first have to understand who these two young men were, where they came from, what they carried in their chests, what they were running toward, and what they were running from. Because neither of them was simply an actor looking for work. Both of them were something more complicated, more desperate, more raw than that. And the collision between them, brief, quiet, almost accidental, left a mark on both of them that lasted decades. Let us begin with the one who walked in first. Clint Eastwood Jr. was born on May 30, 1930 in San Francisco, California. He was a big kid, tall, lean, angular in a way that would eventually become iconic, but during childhood just made him awkward and conspicuous. His family moved constantly during the Great Depression, following his father from town to town as the elder Eastwood chased work at gas stations and warehouses and mills. Clint grew up understanding instinctively that stability was a luxury other people had, and that you kept your head down, you showed up, and you did the work without complaint. He was not a natural student. He struggled with grades, drifted through high school without distinction, and graduated without any clear sense of what he was supposed to become. He worked logging camps in Oregon. He pumped gas. He dug swimming pools under the California sun for $3 an hour. He was drafted into the United States Army in 1950 and stationed at Fort Ord in Monterey, California, where he taught swimming to soldiers who would soon be deployed to the Korean War. He was technically close to combat but never sent. That geographic accident, being stationed near Hollywood rather than across the Pacific Ocean, would change everything. A Universal Pictures talent scout noticed Eastwood at Fort Ord. He was the right height, the right build, the right kind of handsome, broad-shouldered and symmetrical with pale eyes that read well on camera. In 1954, after his discharge from the military, Eastwood signed a small contract with Universal, earning $75 per week. He was given bit parts in forgettable films, scenes so minor that his name rarely appeared in credits. He studied acting with a teacher named Jack Coslin. He paid attention, he worked hard. He was exactly what you would expect from a young man who had grown up learning that persistence and discipline were the only currency that mattered. By late 1954, Clint Eastwood was 24 years old, largely unknown, and hungry in the particular way that young men in Hollywood are hungry, not for food, but for the thing that feels like proof of existence. He had been circling the industry's edges for months, taking every audition he could find, doing everything right, and waiting for the door to open. And then James Dean walked through it instead. James Byron Dean was born on February 8, 1931 in Marion, Indiana, just 8 months after Clint Eastwood entered the world on the other side of the same vast country. But those 8 months and those miles between them might as well have been a century and an ocean, because the world James Dean arrived into was almost unrecognizably different from Eastwood's. Where Eastwood grew up with the stoic discipline of a Depression-era family that moved but stayed intact, Dean grew up fractured. His mother, Mildred, was a gentle and artistic woman who played the piano and encouraged her small son's creativity with a tenderness that he would remember and grieve for the rest of his short life. She died of uterine cancer when James was 9 years old. 9 years old, he was sent afterward to live with his aunt and uncle on a farm in Fairmount, Indiana, and his father, a dental technician named Winton Dean, who had never been particularly warm, essentially disappeared from his life. What does a 9-year-old boy do with that? What does he do with the absence of the one person who saw him completely, who made him feel that his sensitivity and his strangeness and his hunger for beauty were not flaws to be corrected but gifts to be cultivated? He does not know, not consciously. He survives. He grows. He becomes, in ways he cannot articulate, a person defined by the shape of that early loss. Always reaching, always searching, always slightly out of reach of the peace that other people seem to carry effortlessly. Dean was not an easy teenager. He was intense and mercurial and could be cruel one moment and heartbreakingly tender the next. He acted in school plays in Fairmount and discovered something important, that on a stage, in a role, he could inhabit a version of himself that the raw world outside the theater would not allow. He moved to California in 1949, tried attending Santa Monica College, and then transferred briefly to the University of California, Los Angeles, before abandoning formal education entirely. He moved to New York. He studied at the Actors Studio under the direction of Lee Strasberg, absorbing the method approach to performance. The philosophy that authentic acting required not imitation of emotion but actual emotional excavation, the practice of reaching into one's own experience and memory, and pain to fuel a performance with something real. The method was controversial. Traditionalists found it self-indulgent and technically sloppy. The old guard of Hollywood, the generation that had been trained in the theatrical tradition of precise diction, controlled movement, and technical mastery, looked at these method actors and saw chaos dressed up as art. But what the method produced, when it worked, was something the traditional approach rarely touched. It produced truth. It produced the particular quality of watching someone on a screen and feeling not that you are witnessing a performance, but that you are witnessing a person. A real, breathing, suffering human being who happens to be caught on film. Dean had that quality in a way that was almost frightening. Even in his earliest television appearances, something happened when the camera found his face. It was as though the camera understood something about him that he did not fully understand about himself. That his wounds and his longings and his restlessness were not handicaps to be overcome, but the very fuel that would set everything on fire. By 1954, James Dean had done enough television work and enough theater to attract attention in serious industry circles. Elia Kazan, one of the most respected directors in American cinema, the man behind films that had already changed what American movies could do, was preparing to adapt John Steinbeck's novel East of Eden for Warner Brothers. The central role was Cal Trask, a young man desperate for his father's love and approval, tormented by his sense of his own badness, capable of genuine tenderness and genuine cruelty in almost the same breath. It was, in almost every detail, a role that seemed written for James Dean rather than discovered by him. Kazan met Dean, tested him, and felt, by his own account, that he was not choosing an actor for a role so much as he was recognizing a fact of nature. The role was Dean's before the formal audition process was complete. East of Eden began production in 1954, and James Dean began his transformation from a promising unknown into something the industry had not seen in a very long time. But East of Eden would not be released until 1955. In the months between the filming and the release, Dean was not yet famous. He was known in industry circles, talked about in certain rooms, anticipated by people who had seen the footage and understood what was coming. But to the broader world, to the casting offices and the talent agencies, and the waiting rooms where young actors sat in folding chairs and tried to look calm, James Dean was still just a name attached to unproven potential. Which brings us to the autumn of 1954, a small production, a minor project, a contract role that would mean little in the long run to either of the two men who wanted it, posted an audition notice. Two young actors showed up. Clint Eastwood was 24 years old. He had been working at his craft with the steady, methodical discipline that defined everything he did. He had prepared thoroughly, as he always did. He walked into the audition room and delivered a performance that was technically accomplished, controlled, exactly what a prepared professional was supposed to deliver. Everyone in the room recognized that he was good. The casting director nodded. The producer made notes. Eastwood walked out and sat in the corridor, and by the accounts of people who were present that day, he felt reasonably confident. He had done the work. He had shown them what he could do. Then James Dean walked in. What happened in the next 3 minutes has been described by multiple people who were in or adjacent to that room, and the descriptions are remarkably consistent despite their source diversity. Dean did not begin the scene in the conventional way. He did not settle into a technical preparation. He stood in the room for a moment, just a moment, and then something shifted in his face. It was as though he reached somewhere inside himself and found what he needed, and when he opened his mouth and began to speak, the room changed. It was not about volume. Dean was not louder or more theatrical than Eastwood. In fact, by most accounts, he was quieter. The difference was more fundamental than technique. When Eastwood had performed, you saw a skilled young actor doing his job well. When Dean performed, you forgot you were watching a performance. You forgot the casting director and the producer and the assistant with her clipboard. There was just this young man, burning with something, some specific undeniable, almost physical quality of aliveness. And you could not look away. The casting director did not deliberate. The decision came quickly, decisively, without the customary consultations and callbacks that typically stretched minor decisions into minor dramas. The role went to Dean. Eastwood was still in the corridor when Dean came out. He looked at this thin, slightly disheveled young man with the restless eyes, and he asked the question that had been forming in him since he heard the quality of silence from inside that room. He asked how Dean had done it. He asked what Dean had done that was different. Dean's answer was 4 words. Some versions of this story give the exchange as 5 or 6 words, with slight variations in phrasing. But the accounts converge on this essential answer: he had not performed the scene. He had remembered something. He had reached into himself and found something true, and brought that truth into the room with him, instead of constructing a performance around the absence of real feeling. He had not acted. He had remembered. Eastwood was quiet for a moment. Then he thanked Dean. And that was essentially the end of their interaction. 2 young men, briefly intersecting in the corridor of an anonymous casting office, speaking 4 words to each other that would turn out to be among the most consequential 4 words either of them would ever receive. That is not a dramatic story in the conventional sense. There was no fight, no competition that turned bitter, no public humiliation requiring a public correction. What happened between Clint Eastwood and James Dean in 1954 was quieter than that, and perhaps more lasting for its quietness. Because what Eastwood received in that corridor was not a wound that needed healing. It was an education. And Eastwood, being the particular kind of person he was, received it the way he received everything. He absorbed it, considered it, put it to use. But before we follow Eastwood forward, we have to follow Dean. East of Eden opened in March of 1955. The response was unlike anything that had been seen in Hollywood in years. Critics reached for comparisons and found that the available comparisons were insufficient. Here was a young actor doing something that defied the vocabulary of contemporary film criticism, not better than the actors around him in the conventional, measurable way, but categorically different, operating from a place that felt less like craft and more like revelation. The public responded with the particular intensity that young people reserve for artists who seem to be speaking directly to their specific condition of being alive. In 1955, the specific condition of being a young American was complicated in ways that the culture had not yet found language for. The post-war prosperity that surrounded young people was real and tangible, and somehow beside the point. The conformity that prosperity seemed to demand, the suits, the suburbs, the careful management of emotion and ambition and desire into socially acceptable channels, felt suffocating to a generation that had not yet found its voice. James Dean gave them a voice, not through speeches or manifestos, but through the quality of his presence on screen. The way he slouched against walls and stared into distances and occasionally erupted with a grief so uncontrolled and so clearly real that audiences who had spent their lives being told to contain themselves felt something loosen inside their chests. Rebel Without a Cause followed East of Eden later in 1955. Here was Dean in color. Dean is the centerpiece of a film designed to examine exactly the generational tension that his mere presence embodied. Jim Stark was every teenager who had ever felt that the adult world was asking him to perform a version of himself that bore no resemblance to who he actually was. The red jacket, the knife fight at the planetarium, the breathtaking intimacy of the scenes with Natalie Wood, and the scene at the top of the hill when Dean crouched on the ground and his face opened into something that looked less like acting and more like a private grief accidentally made public. Giant was in production during the summer of 1955. Dean was playing Jet Rink, a poor ranch hand who discovers oil and is transformed, or rather deformed, by wealth and resentment. The production was difficult. Dean clashed with Rock Hudson, who found his improvisational approach maddening and unprofessional. He was moody and withdrawn between takes, then explosive during them, exhausting to work with and impossible to look away from on screen. The film was not yet finished when everything stopped. On September 30, 1955, James Dean was driving his Porsche 550 Spyder on California State Route 466, heading toward a racing event in Salinas. The car was fast, one of the fastest production vehicles in the world at that time. And Dean was, by the accounts of people who knew him, not always careful when he was behind a wheel. At a rural intersection near Cholame, a Ford Tudor sedan pulled across Dean's path. The collision was immediate and catastrophic. James Dean died at the scene. He was 24 years old. He had been 24 years old for 7 months. The response to his death was the kind of mass grief that the culture had not seen directed at a young person before and would not see directed at one again until a Beatles arrived 8 years later and then left, and a generation mourned its youth. Fan mail continued arriving at Warner Brothers for years after his death. Teenage girls collapsed at theaters showing his films. A rumor circulated. It was false, but it circulated for years, that he had survived the crash and been so disfigured that he had gone into hiding, and that someday he would return. he would not return. But he also, in a particular sense, never left. Clint Eastwood watched all of this from a distance that was geographically small and experientially enormous. He was in Hollywood during the same years Dean was in Hollywood. He was auditioning for many of the same kinds of roles. He read the same notices, heard the same conversations, watched the same industry responses. He was close enough to see everything clearly and far enough outside the circle of Dean's immediate brilliance to observe it without being consumed by it. What he observed, over those years between 1954 and 1955, was a lesson being played out in real time, a lesson about the difference between competence and truth, between a performance that satisfies and a performance that devastates. He had felt that difference in the corridor of that casting office, when 4 words from a stranger had reoriented his understanding of what he was supposed to be doing when he stood in front of a camera. Eastwood did not transform overnight. He was not the kind of person who transformed overnight. His entire character was built around the slow accumulation of lessons applied patiently over time. He continued to work. He landed a contract with CBS Television and was cast in Rowide, the Western series that would make him a household name in the early 1960s. He played Rhoda Yates for 6 seasons, and he was good, reliably, professionally, competently good. But the seed that Dean had planted in that corridor was growing, quietly and steadily, into something that would eventually change everything about his work. In 1964, Eastwood went to Italy and made a film with Sergio Leone that almost no serious Hollywood person took seriously. A Fistful of Dollars was a spaghetti western. The term itself was almost contemptuous, a dismissal dressed as a genre name. But something happened in that film that had not happened in the previous decade of Eastwood's work. He stripped the performance down to almost nothing. The squinting eyes, the unhurried movement, the economy of speech that bordered on silence. And in that stripping, down he found something true. The man with no name was not a performance in the conventional sense. He was a presence, a fact, an atmospheric condition. Dean had said I did not perform. I remembered. Eastwood, through the particular alchemy of time and experience in a low-budget Italian Western, had found his own version of that truth. He did not perform. He inhabited. He arrived. He let the camera find him rather than presenting himself to the camera. The trilogy of films he made with Leone, A Fistful of Dollars for a Few Dollars More, and The Good, The Bad and the Ugly, created a persona that was paradoxically more powerful for its apparent emptiness. An audience watching Eastwood in those films was not told how to feel. They were put in the presence of something and left to respond. The response, it turned out, was enormous and enduring in ways that nobody in 1964 would have predicted. High Plains Drifter in 1973, The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1976, which Eastwood also directed, Unforgiven in 1992, which won him his first Academy Awards as both director and producer, $1 Million Baby in 2004, which won him another Academy Award for Best Director and gave the world a film that operated, in its quiet devastation, with the kind of emotional truth that a certain cadaverous young man in a casting corridor had described to him in 1954. Do not perform, remember. Eastwood never spoke about Dean in a way that suggested rivalry or resentment. When he talked about Dean in interviews, and he did talk about him occasionally over the decades, it was always with a quality of recognition that went beyond the professional. He spoke about Dean the way a person speaks about a teacher who altered the fundamental architecture of their understanding. Not warmly, exactly. Eastwood was not given to easy warmth, but with a precision and a specificity that suggested the memory was not vague nostalgia, but something he had returned to and examined many times. He said, in various interviews across various decades, that Dean had shown him something about the difference between acting and being. He said that the quality Dean brought to a role, the quality that made audiences feel they were witnessing a real person rather than watching a skilled professional, was not a technique in the conventional sense, but a form of courage. It was the courage to bring yourself into the room, actually yourself, with your actual wounds and your actual longing and your actual grief, rather than constructing a facsimile of those things from outside. That kind of courage, Eastwood observed, required a particular relationship with one's own interior life. Dean had it in an almost unmanageable abundance. The same interior richness that made him extraordinary on screen also made him difficult in person, restless, unable to fully inhabit the ordinary social world. The intensity that the method celebrated and that Dean embodied was not free. It came with costs that Dean paid all the time, in all the ways that people who cannot turn their emotional sensitivity off or down pay for that sensitivity. Eastwood, by temperament, was different. He was not Dean and would never be Dean and had no interest in trying to be Dean. But what he had taken from that 4 word exchange in a corridor was not an instruction to become dean. It was permission to reach past the technical scaffolding of his craft and find the real material underneath, to trust that what was true about himself could be more powerful than anything constructed to appear true. The craft he built over the subsequent 50 years of his career was built on that permission. The contained ferocity of his performance in Unforgiven. The weary, morally exhausted grace of his work in $1 Million Baby. The devastating final scene of Gran Torino, where he stands on a lawn with his arms spread and his face open, and the audience understands everything about who this man has been and what he is choosing to do. And it lands with the weight of something absolutely true, because it is absolutely true. Not true to a script, but true to something that Eastwood reached into himself and retrieved. Do not perform. Remember, the story of James Dean is most commonly told as a tragedy. A young man of enormous gifts, consumed by the very intensity that made him great, cut short at 24 before he could grow into the full dimensions of what he might have become. And there is truth in that telling. His death was a loss, a specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable loss. And the grief it generated in the millions of people who recognized themselves in him was not sentimental exaggeration, but genuine mourning for a voice that had just barely begun to speak. But the story of James Dean is also, in a way that is less often told, a story about the mysterious persistence of influence, about the way that genuine truth, when it is encountered even briefly, even in a hallway, even in 4 words exchanged between strangers who will never speak again, does not disappear when the person who spoke it disappears. It moves forward. It travels through time in the work of the people who received it. It multiplies. Clint Eastwood received something in that corridor in 1954. He was not able to fully use it right away. He needed years in a different country and a low-budget Western and a patient, decades-long education in his own craft before he understood what to do with what Dean had given him, but he never forgot it. And the work he eventually made, work that will be studied and watched and returned to, for as long as people care about the art of cinema, carries inside it, in some form that is real even if it is not easily named, the residue of that encounter. James Dean walked into a room in 1954 and performed something in 3 minutes that changed the life of a young man sitting in a corridor outside. He did it the same way he did everything, without performing, by remembering he was 23 years old. He had less than a year left to live. He would leave behind 3 films, a legend, a generation of young people who felt less alone because of him, and at least one person who would spend the next 7 decades turning 4 words into a body of work. I did not perform, I remembered. Sometimes the most important thing one artist gives another is not technique or connection or opportunity. Sometimes it is simpler than that. Sometimes it is just a sentence that rearranges the furniture of a person's understanding so thoroughly that they spend the rest of their life discovering new rooms they did not know were there. Clint Eastwood found those rooms. He built his entire career inside them. And somewhere inside the architecture of every great performance he ever gave, every squint, every silence, every moment of devastating emotional honesty that audiences recognized as true before they understood why they recognized it, there is a hallway in 1954, and a thin young man with restless eyes and 4 words that a 24-year-old took home and never stopped thinking about. That is the story. Not of a rivalry and not of a tragedy, but of something rarer and in some ways more moving than either. It is the story of what happens when one artist, briefly, accidentally, without knowing they are doing it, shows another artist the door that leads from the room they are into the room they need to be in. James Dean opened a door. Clint Eastwood spent 50 years walking through it. And the world that watched him walk through, it was given something it would not have had otherwise. Proof that the specific quality of truth that Dean carried in him and that everyone feared was buried with him in that Cholame intersection in September of 1955 was not entirely buried, that it had been passed in 4 words to someone who was built to carry it forward. That is, perhaps, its own kind of immortality, not the kind that photographs preserve or that film reels hold in their silver emulsion, the kind that moves through people, through influence and inspiration and the slow, patient work of artists who were changed by other artists and who change others in turn, the kind that does not end when a person ends, the kind that James Dean, who burned so fast and so completely, left behind him in sufficient quantity to last. He did not perform, he remembered, and in remembering he made it possible for others to remember too, even now, even still, even here. If this story moved you, if something in the collision of these 2 young men in a hallway in 1954 resonated with something you carry about your own craft, your own work, your own search for the thing that is true underneath the thing that is merely skillful. Then subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the lesson James Dean left behind in that corridor does not belong only to actors. It belongs to anyone who has ever stood in front of something they were trying to create and felt the difference between doing it correctly and doing it honestly. And it belongs to anyone who has been lucky enough to encounter, even briefly, someone whose honesty was contagious. Those 4 words, that hallway, that 3-minute audition. They were not the end of anything. They were, for at least one man, the real beginning of everything.